Mother Nature, Mother Nature, she's gonna get you. Yeah, she's gonna get you. Mother Nature, she's grown to hate you, and she's gonna get you. Gonna get you, you betcha.
Every year of my life, that's almost 52.
Welcome to Nature Bats Last on the Progressive Radio Network. It's NBL on PRN.FM. This November the 6th, 2018 edition, episode 121 of Nature Bats Last, comes to you live from Rakino Island in Aotearoa, known to colonisers as New Zealand, as to Wapinga, known to colonisers as Westchester County, New York in the United States. This is Kevin Hester. I would like to introduce Professor Guy McPherson, who's coming back to the show as my co-host. Guy set up this radio station a while ago, over 100 episodes ago, and then he sailed off into the jungle in Belize and left me at the helm of the ship. Things have changed for Guy, and I'd like to welcome him back, and I'd like to know how we got this far and where we're going from here.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it. Thanks especially for ably hosting this show during my 14-month vacation as I pursued the adventure of a lifetime in Central America, in the country of Belize, home to terrible telecommunications infrastructure, which is why I was unable to regularly host from down there. Regular listeners will know I've been away for a while. I didn't ever leave the show. I just took a 14-month vacation. The rock and roll crowd out there will recognize that line as coming from the group known as the Eagles. They pointed out during their Hell Freezes Over tour that they didn't break up. They just took a 14-year vacation. So I'm back.
Welcome back to the show, mate. Let's have a little bit of a talk about your time in Belize and what brought you back to the United States, and we'll go through some of the issues that have unfolded since you've been away. Are you still there, mate?
Yes, I am. Sorry, you faded out for just a minute there. Yes, I was 27 months altogether in Belize, and I tried to call in and had mixed success with that for the first year about, and then finally just bailed out for a variety of reasons. Central America was very good to me, and I moved there because of my message. I moved there for love, and I moved back here for the same reason. I moved back to the United States for love. One of the reasons I left the United States was because I loved being out of the United States. I loved being away from my country of birth. That was one of the loving reasons I left the country in the first place. And I'm back because my partner's sister is in the midst of her death throes with multiple myeloma in rural Illinois. And it seemed like a good place and a good idea for my partner to be as we reached the end, so to speak. In addition, her adult children live in this area, and it was pretty clear that they would have limited interaction with us in Central America. So this makes it a lot easier here in Westchester County, about an hour north of New York City, to interact with her adult children. So those are the primary reasons for moving back. As I indicated, Belize was really the adventure of a lifetime. I greatly enjoyed my time there, and so far I'm enjoying my time here in relatively rural New York State, although not far from one of the larger metropolitan areas on the planet.
I had a pretty interesting experience in Belize in the mid-1980s. I went there. I was en route to Nicaragua. I was going to go down and support the Sandinista revolution. And in those days, I was an electrician, and I thought I'd be able to go down and do some good work down there. And I was stopped on the border of Guatemala and El Salvador, and they wouldn't let me through because they didn't like the look of me, and probably saved my life as a result. But what I did get to do when I was in Belize is dive the reefs around Key Corker, and they were absolutely spectacular. And, you know, I keep a pretty good eye on the coral reefs around the world because I'm so interested as a sailor, as an environmentalist, and as a diver. And I can't comprehend the trauma that those reefs have gone by in those 30 years since I've been down there.
Yeah, they're still remarkably intact, at least compared to the Great Barrier Reef. And I'm not sure why that is. Perhaps it's because they're all coated in oil from the Macondo disaster. So that's keeping them safe from the high temperatures that lead to coral bleaching. I'm not sure, but whatever it is, I was fortunate to be able to spend a little bit of time on the reefs, although we lived in the Maya Mountains quite a ways from the ocean. And that was an incredible experience, living in the jungle all by itself. One of the other great things about living in Belize was my partner invested heavily in making sure that we would have comfortable guests. So in the 27 months we were there, we didn't have 7 days in a row go by without a guest. So we had lots of visitors, friends we hadn't met, and some we had, who came down and wanted to have the conversation that so few people are willing to have. So we were able to accommodate that. We still are, in fact. We have a very large townhouse, not just for the two of us, here an hour north of New York City, but instead so that we can accommodate guests here who are willing to have the conversation so few people are willing to have. So we have a spare room or two if anybody's interested in reaching out and making a visit, having the discussion that is uncomfortable, too uncomfortable for most people. Well, hit me up. Not that hard to find. And we are, again, willing to have that conversation that is so important to us. My work has become our work, and it is important to us that we have those conversations. We know that very few people, as they go through their daily lives, are able to have that conversation. You can't show up at the water cooler and start talking about near-term human extinction without getting a lot of stink eye from your coworkers. So plan your visit.
That's incredibly generous of you to carry on with your message, and also making people welcome into your life, into your personal life. Why would you carry on? Why would you keep talking about this predicament that we find ourselves in?
Specifically because it is so hard to talk about, and because I struggled early on with comprehending and living fully in light of this message, and I've seen many other people who have struggled with it as well. So I'm a teacher. You've heard me say that several times. It's not what I do, it's who I am. And part of that teaching, now that I have left active service from the university, part of that teaching service comes in one-on-one and small group conversations. So if we can facilitate that, we're more than willing to do so. And, it's not like we have a lot of money. My partner did one of the things I did a few years later. She spent all of her money on a homestead where we no longer live. So it's not like we're going to have a big party here or show people a wonderful good time. It's a relatively simple set of living arrangements, but we are willing, able, and actually comfortable encouraging people to have that conversation, which is so difficult for most people to get through. And, as you've come to understand too, Kevin, it's the most important conversation we can have. We're talking about the most important event in human history, the end. So why would we not open ourselves up to having that conversation? I don't view this as being particularly generous. I view it as being an act of service that is absolutely necessary. And there are so few opportunities for people to have the discussion, to even think about it during their daily lives. So why not? Why not have that conversation that so few are willing to have, but seems to me to be absolutely necessary?
I can see some parallels between the situation that we find ourselves in now and the situation that people in Europe found themselves in 1937, 38, and 39. People like Winston Churchill were going around Europe and saying that talking about the re-rise of fascism and that an incredibly terrible time and war was coming, and people accused him of being an alarmist. I think alarmist is the bucket of shit that's thrown at McPherson and Hester all the time, because we want to talk about the biggest story that's unfolding in the history of humanity, and one of the biggest stories that's happened in the billions of years of existence of this planet. I find it extraordinary that we're attacked for talking about the reality of what's unfolding, and it's an extraordinary case in cognitive dissonance for me.
That's an excellent point. Here's an example of a story from the Associated Press. It ran on June 29th, 1989. UN predicts disaster if global warming, this is the headline, if global warming is not addressed by the year 2000. If it's not reversed, in fact, by the year 2000. And the article goes on to point out that coastal flooding and crop failures would create an exodus of eco-refugees, threatening political chaos. This, according to Noel Brown, director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program. And here we are, 2018, 28, 29, whatever, many years after that article was written, many years after the 10-year window of opportunity has expired, and we're seeing exactly what was predicted in this article. We're seeing refugees all over the world at this point. Noel Brown goes on to say, and here's a quote, "Ecological refugees will become a major concern, and what's worse is you may find that people can move to drier ground, but the soils and the natural resources may not support life. Africa doesn't have to worry about land, but would you want to live in the Sahara?" This is from Noel Brown, the director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program in 1989. And he's right. It's not simply the amount of space that we have on planet Earth. It's the amount of arable space, the amount of arable land where we can actually grow food. So the article also predicts 1930s Dust Bowl conditions ranging throughout Canada and the United States wheatlands. And we're seeing that happen as well. We're seeing conditions that are verging on crop failure and projections of crop failure in the very near term. So we are seeing what was predicted to happen many years ago. The political response has been to create additional catastrophe politically and economically. In the United States, the response of the current presidential administration is to send troops to the border to turn the folks away, when in fact it was the United States and other, quote, first world nations that contributed most to this problem, either through political and economic activities, and also because it's these first world countries like the United States that burn most of the fossil fuels that led exactly to the situation that was predicted so many years ago.
As usual, the United States always reverts back to if every problem you see looks like a nail, the only solution you have is a hammer. So they're just going to throw the military at everything. It's the same old story everywhere you look.
It really is, and you're right with the hammer and nail analogy. We've known what was coming for a long time, and there were opportunities for the military-industrial complex to not resort to the hammer, to not see this as a nail, but instead to take decisive, forward-thinking, progressive action. I mean, how many presidential administrations have we had since 1989 when that warning came? Several. So and they've all known, in fact, you could argue convincingly, I believe, that the presidential administrations knew, dating back to 1847, when a certain American naturalist talked about climate change to come. And you could argue that they've known since the first Referee Journal article was published on the topic in April of 1896. So it's not as if this is a huge surprise. This has been coming for a long time. The warnings have been coming for nearly the same amount of time. Here we are. And what's the political response? Just send in the troops? This is absolute nonsense. This is ridiculous. This is a compassionate approach. And this, from a presidential administration that counts as its base the far-right Christian minority in the United States. And so it's the Christians who are throwing bombs at the climate refugees that the United States created. Maybe I'm stepping a little over the line here, but it seems to me that the response of the United States, and also, for that matter, Western Europe, to a similar situation developing over there, is just about the worst possible response to an international crisis. The least humane, least compassionate response that a nation, or in this case a series of nations, could have come up with is exactly what we're seeing.
All of those NATO nations have become completely and utterly subservient to the United States. They just do whatever the United States says. Paul Craig Roberts, who's a former official in the Reagan administration, he's been completely assailing the North Europeans for the fact that they just blindly follow along with the United States with its provoking of their neighbor, of Russia. It's extraordinary how the re-rise of fascism is happening contemporaneously with the unraveling of the biosphere. You can see that classically in Brazil, where they've democratically elected a card-carrying, misogynist fascist. And don't forget that Brazil is a huge manufacturer of armaments. Yeah, it's the perfect storm. Orwell couldn't have written this story.
Right. And you mentioned Paul Craig Roberts, and thank you for doing that. In what I believe is still his most recent article at paulcraigroberts.org, he goes off track for him. He's not talking about economics or politics in this particular paper. He's talking about climate change, and he hints at the end of the article, he hints at human extinction as a result of climate change. So this is quite a step for somebody whose audience over the course of the last many years has denied anthropogenic climate change, have been seriously skeptical about anthropogenic climate change. And now he's coming out and saying it's here. And he was very measured in the language he used in that paper. But in the end, he comes down on the side of the evidence, which is overwhelming, because that's what he does. He tracks the evidence. He was I believe he was assistant secretary of the Treasury during the Reagan years. I believe that was his title. And he has greatly expanded the scope of his knowledge since that time, many years ago, so that today he's talking about and writing about far more wide-ranging topics than he was even within the last couple of years. So that's great to see somebody with his audience talking about the most important topic in human history.
A few months ago, I emailed him and asked him if he would come on the show, and he replied to me that he didn't think that he was suitably qualified to do so. But I think he would still be a great guest now that he's obviously moved on, where we could talk about the convergence of the geopolitics and the biosphere collapse that we're looking at.
Well, sure. And, I should also point out that this is not the near-term human extinction hour. We've had a lot of quite varied guests on this show over the course of the last few years. And we've had Katie Goodman, who's an actress and singer-songwriter. We've had people who are very skeptical of the evidence underlying near-term human extinction. We don't have to talk about that. We don't with many of our guests. So I think Paul Craig Roberts would be a very interesting guest for us to have. He's one of the people, in my mind, who has continued with a life of learning throughout his adult life. This is quite unlike what I see with most individuals. And it's quite pleasant to see it when somebody is stepping beyond their educational boundaries, stepping beyond what their career says they should be talking about. So that's nice. I think you'd be a wonderful guest. I look forward to having him on the show. And I invited him, as you know, just a couple of days ago. Have not received a response yet. We'll see.
There's been an interesting new initiative that's burst into life in the UK called Extinction Rebellion. And this segues with what you just were talking about before about the US authorities sending the military down to the border to guard it. This Extinction Rebellion is a group of activists in the UK who are fed up, completely fed up, not just with the government and their pathetic response to climate change, but also to the big NGOs. Extinction Rebellion had a demo at the head offices of Greenpeace in England. It was so bloody fantastic. I'm ashamed that I haven't done the same thing myself. I've had a lot of contact with my former associates and colleagues at Greenpeace over this issue and about them not facing the true severity of the crisis. But it was great to see Extinction Rebellion come out and start this new initiative. But I'll be very interested to see how draconian the state treats the activists, because they will want to snuff this out at the very beginning. They won't want it to get any kind of momentum.
Right, it's great that you bring up the Extinction Rebellion. There's a story at peacenews.info, peacenews.info by Gabriel Carlisle from the 1st of November of this year, titled Why I'm Skeptical About the Extinction Rebellion Initiative, and then in parentheses, and why I hope I'm wrong. And mostly he is skeptical because the three demands that the Extinction Rebellion people are making strike him as either pretty vague or almost impossibly utopian. And I tend to agree. However, what I think is absolutely awesome about Extinction Rebellion is that at least people are coming out and are willing to have the conversation that you and I have been having for years. People are willing to consider the idea that even human beings will go extinct, as clever as we are. So that's a major step in the right direction right there.
Yeah, the momentum about people discussing, and people and the media discussing the possibility of near-term human extinction is really, really gaining momentum. There was an article in The Guardian just recently where they talked about the fact that human survival is now in question. You know, it wasn't very long ago you would never have seen such a heading in a mainstream media article like that.
Absolutely. And, you know, we've seen over and over again and pointed out repeatedly how the timeline keeps drawing nearer. Here's my latest example of the timeline drawing nearer than I ever could have imagined just a short time ago. This is from a paper in Motherboard Vice. Vice has their Motherboard division or group, and it indicates that on September 10th of this year, so just about 2 months ago, the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, delivered a speech at the United Nations headquarters in New York, during which he said the world has until 2020 to change course in order to avoid runaway climate change. That's 14 months from now, folks. That's 14 months from now. He says we need to take significant action to avoid runaway climate change. Well, obviously, we're already in runaway climate change, and the evidence for that is quite clear. But I don't see anything happening in the next 14 months that will do anything to head off runaway climate change, just like we didn't see anything in 1989 or over the course of the next 10 years from June 29th, 1989. In fact, I suspect the only thing likely to change the course of runaway climate change between now and 2020 would be the absence of ice in the Arctic, which will lead to the collapse of civilization, and the resultant lack of global dimming or aerosol masking effect would lead very quickly to a catastrophic increase in climate change. That's the only plausible outcome that I can see that will be different than the course we're on, and it, of course, makes things worse. It's not that we like to say that. It's not like we want civilization to collapse, much as I did in the early days before I understood the profound impact of the aerosol masking effect. But not anymore, because I'm actually a humane human being. So anybody at this point who is cheering for collapse of civilization or working to create it clearly doesn't understand the implications for all life on Earth, not just human life, but all life on her Earth, associated with two things: the very abrupt rise in global average temperature as a result of the Earth's lack of aerosol dimming, or global dimming, or the aerosol masking effect, and also the subsequent catastrophic meltdown of the world's 450-some nuclear power plants that would almost certainly strip away the atmosphere of Earth and cause it to be uninhabitable by life going forward. So I don't see any good news coming out of the near future between now and 2020. I see a lot of potential for really bad news, but I hope not, and I'm not much into hope.
On the subject of the aerosol masking effect or global dimming that you and I, rightly, I believe, talk about all the time, I actually have a theory that there is a way they can cool this planet down more. And one of the obvious and immediate ways to achieve that would be to start detonating nuclear weapons. There are thousands of nuclear weapons on this planet that have been built now for nearly 70 years, and these people have been itching to use them, and they've never had a justification for it. What about staving off near-term human extinction with a nuclear winter? They could do good, inverted commas.
Might as well put those nukes to good use, right? I can just imagine that's what the sociopaths are thinking. That we have all these nuclear weapons lying around unused. We might as well put them to use. And look, one of the outcomes, we've never done this experiment before, so we don't know what the outcome will be beyond the very near-term death of a whole bunch of people. But one of the outcomes might be a temporary cooling of the planet. Might be. We don't know. But I can imagine the sociopaths pulling the strings of empire might actually conclude that, hey, it's worth a shot, so to speak. It's worth a bunch of shots. So it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me at all if, knowing what I know about the loss of ice in the Arctic Ocean over the course of the last couple of decades, knowing the profound heating of the planet that has occurred so far, knowing that American empire, and by extension imperialism throughout the world, teeters on the brink, it wouldn't surprise me at all if something as horrifying as a nuclear exchange were to break out. And maybe not even an exchange, from the United States perspective, just every war seems to be a one-way street. In fact, Bill Hicks had a great sadly humorous routine back in the olden days when he was alive. He said, the thing about a war is it has two sides. And he was talking about the rampant military action by the United States at that time, which was pretty one-sided back in the early 1980s and early 1990s. So it hasn't gotten any better, folks. That's clear.
Spiraling into the abyss in an exponential, non-linear way. Hey, there was a paper that was published by the Scripps Institute of Oceanography that I wanted to discuss on the show, and I sent it to you earlier this morning. I posted it on my facade book wall a couple of days ago, and it was talking about that the oceans have absorbed 60% more heat than previously thought. Than previously thought meme comes up again every single day. And
right.
There's a whole lot of us engaged with it on my wall. And then when you open the link today, it's gone. It's been pulled from the Scripps website. Fortunately, I've got a series of articles from WAPO and another couple of media outlets where they had covered the same thing. So they can't get rid of the story completely. But I found it unique but not surprising that article has been pulled. The reason it's been pulled is, think about it. If the figures that you put into an equation are 60% out, your equation is worthless.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's consistent with so many projections and predictions throughout climate change history that we underestimated somehow the amount of heat that was going to be stored in the ocean. If that comes as a surprise to people, then you haven't been paying the slightest bit of attention over the course of the last few decades. Of course we underestimated. Of course there's a bunch of heat there that accounts for, to a great extent, the energy balance of the planet that has had a missing piece for quite some time. So, of course the ocean is warmer than we imagined. Of course everything is happening so much faster and so much hotter than we ever could have imagined 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, than George Perkins Marsh could have imagined in 1847. Of course it is, because that's what happens when you release the kind of energy that we have released through burning fossil fuels. This extinction event is proceeding approximately an order of magnitude faster than the Great Dying, which was the worst of the mass extinction events so far. And One of the reasons for that might just be because we're burning fossil fuels and contributing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere about an order of magnitude faster than happened during the Great Dying. So what would you expect? I would expect things to go south about an order of magnitude faster than they did during the Great Dying. Of course I would expect that. I would expect extinctions to be occurring much more rapidly. And the response, the horrifying, halfway, ridiculous response of entities, government entities, including the United Nations and corporations, has been to float out ideas like we need to stop global warming at 1.5 degrees above the baseline. Well, guess what, folks? We're at 1 3/4 degrees right now. And the only thing that's going to get us back to 1.5 is a time machine. And we don't have one of those lying around.
Oh, but surely if you just get a solar panel, it'll be okay.
You know, you live off grid. I lived off grid for about a decade. We tried to do the right thing, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. How many times have I said that? It seemed like a good idea at the time. And I had a 3.15 kilowatt solar array and 2 solar pumps and a hand pump at the mud hut in New Mexico. And I thought, when I started that project in 2007, and when I started looking for the place to land in 2004, there was very little known about the aerosol masking effect. And so what I was doing and what you were doing seemed like nothing short of brilliant at the time. But now we know, based on the very conservative referee journal literature, now we know that we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction. Now we know that we're in the midst of abrupt climate change. Now we know about global dimming. And speaking of things disappearing from the public view, how about the BBC episode about global dimming that was online from the time it was produced in 2005 on YouTube? And then suddenly, less than a month ago, it disappears. It's no longer available on YouTube. Isn't that curious? Suddenly, when global dimming starts to enter the public conversation, and it becomes known exactly how profound the effect is, now all of a sudden the go-to source for a 1-hour view just vanishes.
How convenient. Very, very soon we're going to have 5 billion very angry young people. We're all going to have to start thinking about what we're going to say to these young people as this dawns on them. They already know that the situation is dire. As each day goes by, the situation gets more and more dire, and they have less and less hope, inverted commas, for their future. All of us are going to need to start thinking about how we're going to talk to these young people and what we're going to say to them and what we're going to suggest they do for their short, immediate futures.
Yeah, and you know, we catch all kinds of adverse reaction because we are pointing out what I would consider the worst case scenario. But which is better? Which is better, to be warned about the storm, to be warned about the sword of Damocles that's hanging over your head, or not be warned? I've talked to a lot of people who actually appreciate the warning, even though the diagnosis is terminal, even though the situation is beyond the ability to fix, to repair, to make any difference at the level of society or even our species. Still, I hear from so many people that they actually want to know about the diagnosis concerning their near-term demise, along with that of our species. Is it horrifying? Is it sad? Yes, absolutely. There's no doubting that. Is it difficult to digest, to integrate, to live your future knowing the future is short? Yeah, it's really hard. You know, I try to live with urgency and it's exhausting. It's just downright tiring to be on all the time, to not want to miss anything, to want to see every leaf fall in the autumn here in the northeastern United States. And of course that's exhausting. But
Sorry, go on.
no, go ahead.
My default position as a sailor is to always plan for the worst possible storm. So once I got over trying to prove you wrong after spending 2 years doing it, and once I finally reluctantly accepted the prognosis, I've started preparing for the perfect storm, because that's what any sailor does, and that's what any pragmatic person does. And because we're being lied to by not just by the normal powers to be, but by the big NGOs and by the green political parties like the Green Party of Aotearoa, New Zealand, who I was a former member of, because they're lying about the severity of the crisis, we're not preparing like we could be. There's a whole lot of things we could do to make the landing softer, to mitigate in the short term, to make the most of every day. And they just keep lying about this problem being, the 2100 meme, and then it came back to the 2050 meme, and now it's come back to the 2030 meme, for the 12 years we've got. It's just dereliction of duty.
The 2030 is the IPCC's official latest report, but I need to point out again that the Secretary General of the United Nations says we have until 2020 to turn the ship around. And I don't see the ship being turned around in any direction except falling off a waterfall that nobody knew was out there.
The last newspaper article you'll hear is that, the shit's hit the fan, folks, but we'll have it sorted out in 6 months. We'll get back to it.
Right. Here's a headline from the MIT news service, that's the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the headline reads, an extinction without warning. The subhead is, study finds in Permian extinction, which wiped out most of Earth's species, was instantaneous in geological time. They look back through 30,000 years prior to the post-Permian extinction event, the worst of the extinction events so far, the so-called Great Dying, and found that there was essentially no evidence of species dying off, that in other words, it hit without warning. And I fear that that's what we're looking at today, with almost nobody on planet Earth aware that we're even in the midst of a mass extinction event, much less that it might include Homo sapiens as among the species that will go extinct. I think that's tragic.
I think that the place that it will emanate from will be the oceans. We've already talked about the oceans acting as a battery and taking most of the load. And the oceans are already at carbonate saturation already. We have red tides bursting out all around the place, extremely large hypoxic areas where the oceans are dead. And there's a phenomenon called cane field oceans, where the oceans start emitting hydrogen sulfide. Is that right? I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I think it is. And when I interviewed Professor Andrew Glickson from the ANU, the Australian National University, I said to him, "Can you see us seeing Canfield oceans soon?" And his immediate reply was, "We already are."
Wow. And here's another example.
It can tip and trip into ocean wide. I live right beside the ocean. You've sat in my lounge. I'm only meters away from it. One day there could be toxic fumes coming out of that ocean, gassing me in my bed.
That's right. And another example, this too from Motherboard Vice. The headline reads, the seafloor is dissolving because of climate change. Ocean acidification is setting off a dangerous feedback loop. That's a phrase we didn't hear until quite recently. That's dissolving the very bottom of the ocean.
I think the best example of where people can find feedback loops is in your monster climate change essay on your website. It's got its own tab. I've used that and posted it on my website as well. If anyone just does a quick Google search of tipping points, they'll come up with thousands and thousands of articles. one of the problems with tipping points is you don't know that they've happened until they're in the rear vision mirror. But no one wants to look in the rear vision mirror. They always want to pretend that there's some way out, there's some silver bullet.
Yes, and the IPCC continues to downplay or completely ignore the tipping points. So I'm not surprised that so few people know about them, because nobody's talking about them.
It should be no surprise to us that the IPCC doesn't talk about tipping points. One of the major drivers of the Permian extinction was methane. And you, myself, lots of others, the Arctic Methane Emergency Group, Peter Wadhams, Paul Beckwith, et al., they are all breathtakingly concerned about the melting permafrost and the clash rates in the ESAS, the East Siberian Arctic Shelf. And the IPCC succeeded in ignoring it completely recently.
Yeah. It's much easier to ignore, especially if you're a political body like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's much easier to ignore than to come to grips with the full reality of the situation. And when you have the attack dogs come out when somebody comes too close to the truth, then you can understand why people might back away. Here's a classic example. In a relatively recent article in The Guardian, the author took serious issue with Peter Wadhams and I. It was a hit piece, basically, by The Guardian, published, I think, in July of this year, pointing out that we're crazy, that we're alarmists, that there's no data, no evidence to support what we're saying. Well, obviously there is. Peter Wadhams is the world authority on the Arctic ice. He's made 50 expeditions above and beneath the Arctic ice. He might have an idea what he's talking about, and yet he gets hit pieces written about him when he points out the direction we're going. Trust me, that's not a lot of fun, people, to have that sort of animus directed your way. So I can see why people are unwilling to go all the way with the full evidence with respect to abrupt climate change. It's easy to understand.
It's incredible that the field researchers like Dr. Natalia Shakova, Igor Semelitov, and Peter Wadhams, I'd say those three people have probably spent more time under the Arctic than all the other, under and on the Arctic, than all the other researchers put together. Their field research tells us that this 50 gigaton burst of methane is possible at any time, at any moment. And because it doesn't fit the models, and it doesn't fit the business model for selling shares on the share market, whether you're a newspaper or whatever corporation you're behind. Because it doesn't fit the models. And you've got to remember, with these modelers, there's been a lot of money invested in those models. A lot of these modelers have spent their whole lives on them. They're not going to put their hand up near the end and say, sorry, folks, I blew it. Wrong inputs.
Right. And again, it's tragic. It's irresponsible. It's maddening when the corporate media and the governments will only go part way, and yet on the other hand, it makes perfect sense, because as I pointed out a few hundred times, there's no money in extinction, and this society, this entire culture is so enamored with money, so absolutely convinced that money is all that matters, that of course they're not going to put out information that might interrupt people's inclinations for shopping. Don't be ridiculous.
It's one of the motivating things for me to carry on doing what I'm doing is that I believe, at the very least, the last generation of youth deserve the truth. I am not going to be lying to the last generation of youth as we go off the cliff to tell them that it's going to be okay if we do this or do that, or it's all going to hit the fan later on. The shit has already hit the fan. They know it. They can see through those lies, and I'm not going to be one of them.
Of course they can see through it. It's clear at this point to anybody paying attention that the shit is not hitting the fan. The fan is covered in shit, and the shit is hitting the shit. There's no way it can reach the fan at this point. And it's been like that for quite a long time. And yet it's so much easier to deny and move on, to act like everybody else acts, to act as if there's nothing amiss. And yet, you know, and I know, dozens, perhaps hundreds of people who have been liberated by this message, who appreciate knowing the full truth, while not being told their expiration date, because we don't know that. But knowing that time is short is actually useful, helpful, appreciated by so many people, as opposed to the lies and the half-truths that the society, the culture, the corporations, the governments, the universities are so accustomed to trotting out. But responsibility, anybody? Come on. I mean, here's another headline for you. This from Eon. We are heading for a new Cretaceous, not for a new normal. We are heading for a new Cretaceous. That's hothouse, folks. That's dinosaur days. We're headed, in other words, for a very, very rapid rise in global average temperature, the likes of which allowed for crocodilian species at the poles millions of years ago. Well, when it was Cretaceous days, during that time, it took a very long time for the planet to heat up enough to lose the polar ice. That's not the case this time. This time we're going there very quickly. According to a 2012 paper in the Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences, we're headed for an ice-free Arctic in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. I can't believe we dodged 6 bullets on that topic so far. But here we are. According to the projection, we can expect an ice-free Arctic next year, even if they're wrong by a year or two. Time is still short. We don't survive with an ice-free Arctic for very long, and we're headed there in the very near term. If you haven't started living your life with urgency at this point, if you haven't taken seriously those relationships in your life, then I don't know when you're going to be able to do that, because I don't think you're going to have that amount of time that you think you have.
For all the hundreds of people that attack us, there are 1 or 2 people who are really, really grateful for us enunciating the severity of the crisis and setting them free. I have a group of wonderful friends, a small tribe on Rakino Island where I live, and the people who know about it and have accepted it are really positive about the fact that they've come to terms with it. And, you know, these people, in conjunction with me, we run a not-for-profit native nursery where we're propagating trees. I'm propagating trees that I don't think will have much of a life, but I'm still going to be planting trees until the lights go out. I'm working on a project with my next door neighbours on the island group in front of me, the Noisies group, to set up a marine reserve in front of between our two islands. This knowledge doesn't create paralysis. It's a lie that the big NGOs say they're scared of paralysis. It sets you free. It gives you the opportunity to live a life that you might not have if you thought you had a lot more time.
You're absolutely right. So you have people like distinguished Professor Michael Mann pointing out that it's wrong, it's paralyzing, it takes us in the wrong direction by pointing out the full truth. That's actually not supported by refereed journal literature. In fact, the opposite is the case. People tend to respond to an emergency. People tend to not respond, or to respond with complacency when the future looks rosy. So if you keep telling people that we're going to have a problem in 2100, I guarantee nobody's going to do a damn thing between now and 2099. I
wrote an article on my website about and I've titled it "The Liar Michael Mann." He was quoted in a Salon article where he said, and you won't believe this is going to make our listeners choke. He said, if we introduce a carbon fee over the next few decades, we can still achieve 1.5C.
Oh.
Now, that is pure, unadulterated lies. I've copped a lot of shit for calling Michael Mann a liar, but he is lying. There's no question that he is lying. I used to have a lot of respect for him, and I had some good online communications with him. Years and years ago, I said to him that I thought we were going extinct in the near term, and he said, I can't go there yet. Okay, so that was denial at the time, but it's morphed into lies. I would suspect that the U.S. military has guaranteed him a place in a bunker.
Well, and it's because of that reaction of his, because of the going halfway and the outright lies, that we did an entire episode dedicated to his work and his lack of urgency. Kevin, it's time to wrap up this version of the show. Why don't you take us home?
Okay, we'd very much like to thank our listeners. You can catch MBL on PRN the first Tuesday afternoon of each month at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The next episode will be broadcast live on Tuesday afternoon, the 4th of December. If you miss this live broadcast, you can find it in the archives at prn.fm, on the Podbeam, or at Stitcher. And feel free to rate us on iTunes. As you can also continue to follow Nature Bats Last at guymcpherson.com, Guy's website, for future updates, interviews, and speaking tours. And you can keep current with my work at kevinhester.live. Thanks again to our listeners and to Afrozen for his music. And until the next time, remember, the dominant culture has been clever, but in the end, nature bats last.
Mother Nature, she's gonna get you. Yeah, she's gonna get you. Mother Nature, she's grown to hate you, and she's gonna get you. Gonna get you, you betcha.
Every year of my life, that's almost 52 years so far, the world has become a worse and worse place.